Is the weapon fully operational?
Yes, Sergeant. It's cold, but it cycles smoothly. The winter clothing shipment is still incomplete. I want a full report by nightfall.
At once, sir.
January 17th, 1942. Dawn breaks over a frozen Belgian valley. Mist clings to the snow-choked pines. The air is brittle, each breath a cloud of frost. Somewhere ahead, the dull thump of artillery shakes the ground, echoing off the hills. A single German battalion, weary from weeks of relentless maneuvering, huddles along a narrow ridge, rifles clutched in numb fingers, eyes scanning the fog for the enemy. On the Allied side, a small reconnaissance unit moves carefully through the underbrush, boots crunching over ice. Among them is Private Heinrich Bauer, young, alert, yet tense. He adjusts his binoculars and spots what he believes is a minor German outpost, a routine observation. But one glance, one misread signal, will set into motion a chain of events no one on either side could have anticipated. A sudden crack, a misstep on ice, a snapped twig carries across the valley. Somewhere, a German officer curses under his breath. And in that frozen silence, the delicate balance of observation, trust, and timing begins to unravel. By the end of the day, an entire battalion will be forced to surrender, all because of one simple mistake. By the winter of 1942, the Second World War had become a grinding contest of attrition across Europe. On the Western Front, German forces had consolidated their gains in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, fortifying positions along natural barriers, rivers, and high ground. Despite the apparent stability, the front lines were far from static. Small Allied reconnaissance missions probed enemy positions, seeking weaknesses, while German units rotated between garrison duty, field operations, and defensive patrols. The German battalion in question belonged to the 262nd Infantry Division, a unit formed in late 1940 and seasoned in rapid maneuvering and defensive operations. It consisted of roughly 600 to 700 men, organized into 3 rifle companies, a heavy weapons platoon, and support elements including signals, medics, and logistics. Commanded by Major Klaus Richter, the battalion had seen action in multiple engagements across France and Belgium, developing a reputation for disciplined, coordinated defense. Yet, the long months of cold, fatigue, and constant vigilance had frayed morale. Soldiers slept in frozen foxholes, rationed food, and endured relentless drills meant to maintain readiness against an enemy they rarely saw. On the Allied side, a combined British and Belgian reconnaissance force had been tasked with monitoring German troop movements along the Ardennes sector. The unit was small, no more than a platoon of 30 men, but highly trained. Equipped with light mortars, rifles, and rudimentary radio communications, their objective was not to engage in direct combat, but to relay intelligence that could guide larger Allied offensives. Every movement was calculated, every step measured, yet the forested terrain and foggy valleys amplified the risk. One misjudged turn or misread signal could spell disaster. The strategic context magnified these risks. Early 1942 marked a transition in Allied strategy on the Western Front. After the evacuation at Dunkirk and the subsequent defensive buildup, British command sought to reclaim initiative through limited offensives and intelligence operations. Reconnaissance units were the eyes and ears of this plan, tasked with probing German defenses, identifying weak points, and sometimes testing reactions to feint attacks. Their reports could determine where artillery strikes fell or which positions were vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. Every decision carried consequences that reached far beyond the forested valleys they patrolled. For the German battalion, the forest was both shield and trap. The thick undergrowth and icy gullies provided cover, but they also obscured vision, hindered movement, and complicated communication between companies. Radios were limited and line of sight often dictated the effectiveness of signals. Orders from Major Richter traveled slowly, filtered through runners or field telephones, leaving room for misinterpretation. Soldiers had learned to rely on instinct, drill, and the routines of command, but in the fragile stillness of the Ardennes winter, these routines could be disrupted in an instant. In this environment, Private Heinrich Bauer's reconnaissance mission began as routine. The Allied unit moved under cover of early morning mist, careful to avoid patrols and listening posts. Bauer, armed with binoculars and a map, had been trained to observe patterns, record true positions, and report back without engaging. Yet the human element, fatigue, anxiety, the fog of war, meant that even a well-drilled soldier could falter. The battalion he observed, unaware of the tiny eyes watching from the tree-line, maintained its rigid formation, believing the terrain itself would warn them of any encroaching threat. The convergence of these factors, strategic pressure, winter conditions, the limitations of communication, and human fallibility, created a landscape where a single mistake could cascade into a catastrophe. The scene was set not for heroism, but for miscalculation. And as Bauer raised his binoculars that January morning, the delicate balance of reconnaissance, deception, and vigilance began to tilt ever so slightly. By mid-morning, minor shifts in the German formation went unnoticed. Patrols missed subtle sounds. Runners failed to deliver orders on time, and Bauer's observation, meant to be discreet, introduced the first thread in a chain that would unravel an entire battalion. The stage was set for one soldier's error to reverberate through both Allied and German ranks, with consequences that would astonish commanders on both sides. The frozen valley, the mist, and the fragile lines of communication created an environment where luck, timing, and human error intersected. The perfect conditions for history to pivot on a single moment. The morning of January 17th, 1942, was unnervingly quiet. The forested Ardennes Valley lay under a thin layer of frost, every branch etched in white, every footstep leaving a stark imprint in the frozen soil. The German battalion, positioned along a ridgeline that overlooked a narrow road winding through the valley, conducted routine morning checks. Machine guns were cleaned, rifles inspected, and sentries posted at intervals that commanders considered sufficient to detect any minor Allied probe. Major Klaus Richter moved among his companies, clipboard in hand, tallying supplies and listening for updates from his platoon leaders. Though the men were disciplined, weeks of exposure to cold and limited rations had left them tense and easily startled. Meanwhile, Bauer's reconnaissance team advanced cautiously through the lower slopes of the valley. Their movement was deliberate, calculated to avoid detection, yet the fog made every shadow, every sound, uncertain. Bauer, tasked with mapping the battalion's positions, moved ahead of the main group. He noted the arrangement of foxholes, the placement of machine guns, and the positions of officers. In his mind, this was routine work, the kind of observation that could decide whether Allied artillery would strike that afternoon or the next day. Yet subtle distractions crept in. A snapped twig underfoot, the distant echo of a German patrol, the clatter of snow loosening from branches. The mind begins to play tricks under such conditions, and even the smallest error could have magnified effects. At the same time, the German battalion remained unaware of the proximity of the Allied observers. Their assumption of terrain-based security was reinforced by months of patrolling the same sector, and the soldiers were conditioned to rely on familiarity. Only a few sentries noticed movement in the tree line, fleeting glimpses of shadows among the fog, but these observations were dismissed as wildlife or shifting light. The battalion's communication network was stretched. Runners traversed icy gullies and frozen streams, often arriving late or exhausted. A misheard order or delayed message could, and would, have consequences in the hours ahead. The geography of the Ardennes compounded the risk. Narrow valleys, ridges, and dense underbrush created natural choke points. An isolated unit could be cut off in moments. Every ridge line offered both protection and vulnerability. Every bend in the road could conceal a squad waiting to strike. Both German and Allied forces understood this implicitly, yet the reality of executing perfect coordination in such terrain was almost impossible. Minor mistakes, delayed signals, misjudged distances, overlooked shadows could escalate exponentially. By mid-morning, Bauer's focus shifted from observation to interpretation. He believed he saw an isolated German outpost ahead, one not connected to the main line. Misjudging distance and failing to account for the dense fog, he signaled what he thought was routine information back to his commanding officer. This was the moment where human perception met battlefield uncertainty. A single gesture, a misunderstood signal, could cascade. On the German side, officers misread the lack of immediate engagement as calm, while sentries misjudged the significance of movement in the mist. The battlefield, still frozen and silent, held its breath. Every element, the terrain, the weather, the human limitations, combined to form a fragile equilibrium. The soldiers of the German battalion followed routines, trusting drills over instinct. Bauer relied on training, yet misinterpreted what he saw. The day was ordinary. It was precisely this ordinariness that made the forthcoming error so consequential. A misread signal here, a misunderstood command there, and the balance of power in the valley would shift dramatically, setting the stage for a capture unprecedented in scale and entirely unexpected by either side. By early afternoon, both sides were positioned, unaware of how one minor mistake would soon unfold. The frozen valley, fog-draped trees, an intricate web of human decisions created a pressure cooker of circumstance. History, often shaped by grand strategies and sweeping battles, sometimes turns on a single, quiet moment. The flick of a wrist, the glance through binoculars, the snap of a branch underfoot. And in this case, that moment was approaching. War is rarely won by strategy alone. It is won, or lost, in the minds of men. The human element of this engagement cannot be overstated. On the German side, the soldiers of Major Richter's battalion were disciplined and experienced, yet the endless winter had a subtle, insidious effect. Fingers stiffened and cold, eyes strained to penetrate fog, and mental fatigue gnawed at decision-making. Each soldier had been conditioned to trust routine, to rely on drills and habit rather than improvisation. But when the unexpected arrived, the mind hesitated. Private Bauer, the Allied observer, was equally human in his vulnerabilities. Young, alert, and trained to follow procedures, he moved with purpose through the underbrush. Yet even the most experienced soldiers can misread a scene when fog blurs lines, shadows conceal depth, and fatigue slows reaction. Bauer's misinterpretation of a German outpost positioning, a seemingly minor mistake, would ripple outward, amplified by human perception and error. On the battalion level, the German soldiers reacted instinctively. When the first signs of encroachment appeared, a shadow, a muffled crunch, they paused, eyes scanning, hesitation creeping in emotions honed by months of discipline. Their instinct was to wait for orders, to maintain formation, to trust command over gut reaction. This reliance on procedure, combined with the fog and unfamiliar signals, created the psychological conditions that allowed a single observation to trigger a cascade of consequences. From a tactical perspective, the Ardennes Valley presented both opportunity and danger. Narrow ridges offered elevated vantage points, while the dense underbrush and frozen gullies provided natural concealment. For Bauer's reconnaissance unit, these features were essential. A small team could move undetected, report enemy positions, and influence larger-scale maneuvers without ever engaging in direct combat. Yet these same features could turn treacherous in an instant. The German battalion's defensive formation relied on overlapping fields of fire, sentries at intervals, and the assumption that the valley's natural barriers provided early warning. This worked well against conventional reconnaissance or isolated skirmishes, but it assumed that no observer would misinterpret or miscommunicate intelligence. Bauer's unit exploited this assumption inadvertently. When he signaled what he believed was a minor observation, it altered the perceived tactical picture for both sides. The miscommunication created a domino effect. German platoons shifted positions to counter a threat that didn't exist, opening gaps elsewhere. Sentries hesitated, unsure whether to engage or wait for orders. Meanwhile, Allied commanders, interpreting Bauer's signal, adjusted their own plans, moving units into positions that would soon encircle the unsuspecting battalion. The tactical interplay of terrain, unit placement, and perception transformed one small reconnaissance observation into a decisive factor that shaped the battlefield long before bullets were fired. Technology, or rather its limitations, played a pivotal role in the unfolding event. Radios in the German battalion were scarce and largely unreliable in forested, mist-laden terrain. Field telephones required runners, who risked exposure and delays. Even when orders were sent correctly, reception could be incomplete or misunderstood. Signals misread in this environment carried immediate consequences. On the Allied side, Bauer's binoculars provided visual superiority, but they did not offer perfect clarity. Fog, frost, and distance created optical illusions that the mind could easily misinterpret. Light reflected off snow or frozen branches could mimic troop movements, and shadows could conceal real threats. The combination of imperfect technology, environmental interference, and human perception created a scenario where a single mistake could be amplified. Moreover, the limitations of German small arms and machine guns influenced decisions. Firing blindly into fog could waste ammunition and alert the enemy without inflicting damage. Observing through mist meant decisions had to be made with incomplete information. Technology, while providing tools for advantage, also amplified the fragility of human judgment under pressure. These three perspectives, human, tactical, and technological, intertwined to create a delicate balance on the battlefield. Soldiers' perceptions, commanders' expectations, and the limits of available technology all contributed to a scenario where one misjudgment could reverberate across entire units. But the story was far from over. To understand the full impact, we must also consider the enemy perspective, leadership decisions, and the moral and psychological dimensions that transformed a simple error into a historic capture. From the German perspective, the battalion was prepared for routine defensive operations. Yet the enemy, Bauer's small reconnaissance unit, was largely invisible. The German soldiers had trained for ambushes, probing attacks, and minor skirmishes, but nothing in their manuals prepared them for the subtle disruption caused by a misread signal in foggy terrain. Every sound, every shadow was scrutinized, yet most were dismissed as environmental noise. The German situational awareness was limited by the terrain. Ridge lines obstructed views of lower valleys, while the fog made distances deceptive. Patrols sent to confirm movements often returned with incomplete or conflicting reports. In this environment, a single observation could trigger misinterpretation at higher levels. When Bauer's signal reached Allied command, German patrols observed shifts in enemy posture and misread them as a larger offensive, prompting caution and rigid adherence to orders. The battalion became reactive, constrained by fear of an unseen threat, rather than proactive in defending itself. This misalignment between perception and reality magnified the impact of Bauer's mistake. The German battalion's decisions, though procedurally correct, were made under false assumptions. They did not realize that the threat they were responding to was smaller, localized, and ultimately a distraction. By the time they began to interpret the situation accurately, the tactical picture had shifted irreversibly. Leadership played a central role in amplifying the consequences of a single error. Major Klaus Richter, commanding the battalion, was a seasoned officer known for strict adherence to procedure and disciplined coordination. Yet even the most competent leaders rely on accurate information. Richter's decisions on January 17th were based on fragmented reports, delayed signals, and the assumption that the valley's terrain would reveal threats before they became critical. Richter ordered repositioning of companies to counter what he believed to be an approaching Allied flanking maneuver. Every move was calculated to maintain cohesion, yet the speed at which the situation evolved outpaced the communication channels. Officers in subordinate units hesitated, unsure whether to follow orders exactly or adapt to the shifting realities. The battalion's leadership structure, which usually provided stability, became rigid under stress, leaving little room for initiative. This rigidity allowed Bauer's minor misinterpretation to cascade into a major operational advantage for the Allies. Leadership decisions on the Allied side also mattered. Bauer's commanding officer acted on the signal with precision, deploying units into positions that would exploit the gaps created by German caution. The contrast in leadership approaches, adaptive versus rigid, highlighted how a small human error could be magnified or mitigated depending on the command structure and decision-making processes. The psychological dimension of war is often underestimated, yet can determine outcomes as decisively as bullets or artillery. For the German soldiers, the uncertainty created by misread signals generated stress, hesitation, and fear. Every movement in the fog became a potential threat, and the mental strain of constant vigilance eroded confidence. Morale, already frayed by fatigue and winter exposure, became increasingly fragile. On the Allied side, Bauer and his unit experienced a different psychological pressure. The responsibility of accurate observation weighed heavily, knowing that a single mistake could jeopardize not only their mission, but also lives. Ironically, it was precisely this pressure that led to the initial error, a combination of acute awareness and overinterpretation under stress. The moral weight of such errors in warfare is profound. One human misjudgment, whether accidental or unavoidable, can determine the fates of hundreds of men. In this case, Bauer's mistake would not merely affect immediate tactical outcomes. It would shape lives, surrender protocols, and the psychological aftermath of an entire battalion. The soldiers, officers, and commanders would carry the consequences in memory, in reports, and in the sobering recognition of how fragile control can be in the chaos of war. The convergence of these angles, enemy perception, leadership decisions, and psychological pressure, set the stage for the decisive moment. Human error, environmental conditions, tactical movements, and the limits of communication all intertwined. A single misread signal was no longer isolated. It had become the axis upon which the day's outcome would pivot. The frozen valley waited, silent, as the battalion unknowingly edged towards capture. By early afternoon on January 17th, 1942, the Ardennes Valley was a study in quiet tension. Frost sparkled along the ridges, wind whispered through skeletal trees, and snow crunched beneath the cautious steps of Allied scouts. Private Heinrich Bauer had already signaled what he believed was a minor observation, a small, isolated German outpost. But the valley's fog and his misjudged distance magnified its significance. To his commanding officer, it appeared that the German battalion was repositioning to reinforce a threatened sector. Major Klaus Richter, receiving fragmented reports from his platoon leaders, interpreted Bauer's observation as the precursor to a larger maneuver. He ordered the 2nd Company to shift toward the perceived threat, creating a gap in the battalion's southern flank. Officers relayed commands through runners and field telephones, but delays and confusion compounded the effect. Soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to follow orders immediately or adjust to local circumstances. By the time the 2nd Company reached the new position, a critical vulnerability had formed, a vulnerability unseen by the Germans, but visible to Bauer and his unit. The Allied reconnaissance team recognized the opening. Quietly, they moved along the edge of the valley, positioning themselves to observe the battalion's movements and relay precise intelligence to their command. Artillery units, alerted by Bauer's reports, began moving into pre-designated firing positions. Every misread signal, every delayed order amplified the battalion's exposure. Around 14:30, a subtle shift occurred in the German ranks. Sentries reported movement in the underbrush, shadows too precise, too deliberate to be wildlife. Officers hesitated, consulting maps and reports. Major Richter, constrained by the fog of war and incomplete communication, attempted to verify the threat before committing his forces. This pause, measured in minutes, became critical. Bauer, observing through binoculars from a concealed ridge, noticed the tension below. He recorded the positions of machine guns, rifle teams, and command posts, sending updated signals to his officer. These signals, interpreted by Allied command as confirmation of the battalion's vulnerability, triggered a coordinated response. Units moved to encircle the battalion, exploiting the gaps created by German repositioning. The valley, once silent, now became a stage of mounting pressure. German soldiers, reacting to perceived threats, found themselves shifting in ways that exposed more of their formation. Machine guns were repositioned ineffectively. Rifles covered sectors of low risk, and officers struggled to maintain situational awareness. The battalion's cohesion, usually its greatest strength, began to fray under the compounded effects of human error, terrain, and fog. By 1500 hours, the encirclement was taking shape. Allied units, guided by Bauer's observations, occupied key ridges and approaches, creating overlapping fields of observation and fire. Artillery, still out of sight of the Germans, began adjusting for target acquisition. The battalion, sensing an impending threat but unaware of its full scale, tightened defensive lines, inadvertently restricting mobility. Each decision, grounded in discipline and experience, now served to hasten the unfolding disaster. At this point, Bauer's single misjudgment, interpreting a minor outpost as a significant maneuver, had grown into a critical tactical advantage. The battalion's southern flank, now exposed, became the pivot for encirclement. The soldiers of the 1st and 3rd Companies, moving according to orders, unwittingly funneled themselves into positions that left them vulnerable to observation, artillery adjustment, and eventual surrender. The valley, frozen and fog-draped, held the battalion in a delicate trap they did not yet see. The convergence of terrain, timing, and human perception had transformed a routine reconnaissance mission into a turning point. What began as a minor signal, a single human error, now dictated the movements of an entire battalion. The stage was set for the final moments where coordination, courage, and circumstance would collide, determining the fate of hundreds of men in a frozen valley on a quiet winter afternoon. By mid-afternoon, the German battalion situation had deteriorated rapidly, though the men did not yet fully grasp the extent. From his concealed position, Private Bauer observed the battalion's southern flank exposed and the 2nd Company stretched thin, attempting to respond to phantom threats. Major Richter, receiving delayed and conflicting reports, ordered reinforcements to plug gaps that no longer existed. The fog of war, both literal and figurative, had descended fully over the valley. Around 1545, Allied units advanced along pre-designated ridges. Small infantry squads, guided by Bauer's precise observations, occupied key elevations that commanded lines of fire over the battalion's positions. Artillery observers, using triangulated coordinates from reconnaissance signals, began adjusting howitzers for indirect fire. The battalion's machine guns, fixed on sectors of low threat, could not prevent the tightening noose. What had started as confusion now became a tactical reality. The battalion was being encircled. German soldiers began to notice unusual movements. Shadows on the ridges, the sudden silence of certain approaches, and glimpses of Allied infantry from unexpected directions sowed alarm. Command posts sent runners for clarification, but icy gullies slowed their progress, and some never returned. Major Richter realized, too late, that the unit's southern flank was cut off, leaving only narrow escape routes that were themselves under observation. Every attempt to reposition was delayed, constrained, and increasingly futile. At 16:15, Bauer's commanding officer confirmed the encirclement. The battalion, now effectively hemmed in on 3 sides, had limited mobility, no safe withdrawal path, and incoming artillery fire ready to suppress any attempt at escape. Richter ordered a concentrated defensive line along the ridge, but the men were exhausted, cold, and disoriented. Fear and fatigue compounded the tactical disadvantage. For many soldiers, it became clear that survival would depend not on combat, but on compliance and surrender. The final moments unfolded with astonishing precision. Allied squads closed observation points and cut off remaining access to the valley road. German units, attempting to coordinate a countermove, were slowed by frozen terrain, miscommunication, and panic among exhausted troops. Around 1645, Major Richter gathered his senior officers. They assessed the situation, surrounded, under observation, limited ammunition, and no immediate reinforcement. The choice was stark: fight to the last man in a hopeless engagement or surrender to preserve lives. By 1700 hours, the battalion signaled surrender. White flags appeared along the ridge, trembling in the cold wind. Allied infantry moved cautiously forward, securing the positions and ensuring compliance. The soldiers, once disciplined and alert, now emerged from foxholes and defensive positions with hands raised. Bauer, observing from the tree-line, felt the weight of what had occurred. One misjudged observation had cascaded through command decisions, terrain limitations, and human fatigue to produce the capture of an entire battalion. The surrender was methodical. Equipment was collected, prisoners accounted for, and officers escorted under guard. Reports later noted the astonishing efficiency with which the Allies exploited the error. Bauer's reconnaissance, combined with disciplined follow-up by his commanding officer and supporting units, had turned a simple mistake into a strategic success. For the German soldiers, the loss was shocking. Not merely the defeat, but the realization that it had been precipitated by human error rather than overwhelming force. By sunset, the valley was silent once more. The battalion, intact but captured, had been neutralized without large-scale combat. Allied units withdrew to observation points, ensuring no counterattack could reverse the outcome. The frost-covered trees and snow-laden ridges bore witness to how human perception, compounded by fog, terrain, and timing, could decide the fate of hundreds in a matter of hours. The frozen Ardennes Valley now stood as a testament to the fragile interplay between vigilance and error, preparation and chance. One soldier's misjudgment had rippled outward, touching every company, officer, and soldier, turning routine maneuvers into a historic capture. The battlefield, once a theater of disciplined procedure and expectation, had revealed the unpredictable power of human fallibility. By the evening of January 17, 1942, the full scope of the day's events was becoming clear. The German battalion, once a disciplined formation of 600 to 700 men, was now entirely in Allied hands. Soldiers and officers alike were processed, disarmed, and accounted for. Reports later noted that approximately 680 personnel were captured, along with several machine guns, mortars, and nearly a week's worth of supplies. Vehicles, ammunition depots, and field equipment also fell into Allied control, significantly enhancing the resources available for subsequent operations in the Ardennes sector. Major Klaus Richter filed a formal report, acknowledging the surrender while stressing the confusion caused by miscommunication and environmental conditions. His notes reflected the frustration of an experienced officer who had trained his battalion meticulously, only to see it neutralized without a conventional battle. German higher command, upon receiving word of the capture, expressed shock and concern. The loss was not due to overwhelming firepower, superior numbers, or advanced weaponry. It was precipitated by a single misread observation and the resulting chain reaction in decision-making. On the Allied side, the capture was hailed as a textbook example of reconnaissance influencing operational outcomes. Private Bauer's mistake, paradoxically, had created a tactical opportunity that the unit capitalized on with precision. Allied commanders documented the event extensively, emphasizing the importance of rapid response, disciplined exploitation of enemy errors, and the integration of observation with field maneuvers. Reports highlighted how one small error, in the right circumstances, could yield disproportionately large results, a lesson that would be studied in training sessions for years to come. The psychological effect on the battlefield was immediate. German troops in surrounding sectors were unnerved by news of the surrender. Rumors spread of entire units being captured without significant combat, shaking confidence in the reliability of frontline procedures. Officers emphasized vigilance and reevaluated communication protocols, aware that human error could be exploited. Conversely, Allied forces drew morale from the event. It validated the emphasis on careful reconnaissance, observation, and rapid exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities. For many soldiers, it was a reminder that war often hinged on observation, timing, and the capacity to act decisively on incomplete information. The physical landscape bore the marks of the encounter as well. The frozen valley, once merely a route for patrols and supply, became a focal point for military reports and maps. Positions held by the German battalion were examined and recorded, serving as both a tactical record and a teaching point. Units rotating through the area in the weeks afterward were briefed on the incident, reinforcing the lesson that terrain and observation could turn minor mistakes into decisive outcomes. In terms of operational impact, the capture freed Allied forces to redirect resources elsewhere along the front. Patrols and reconnaissance units were reassigned to exploit gaps in German lines created by the loss. The battalion's absence reduced German defensive capacity in the sector, creating opportunities for further probing attacks and limited offensives. While the broader strategic situation on the Western Front remained largely unchanged, the event demonstrated the value of integrating small unit intelligence with coordinated field action. The event also sparked an internal review within the German command structure. Reports examined the role of terrain, communication delays, and procedural rigidity. Emphasis was placed on improving runner systems, line-of-sight communication, and rapid adaptation to unexpected observation. It became evident that even a disciplined unit could be neutralized if human perception, environmental conditions, and timing aligned against them. By nightfall, the Ardennes Valley returned to a deceptive calm. Soldiers of the capture battalion were gathered in temporary camps under Allied supervision. Their weapons surrendered, their morale subdued but intact. The frozen terrain had witnessed the remarkable unfolding of events. A single human error transformed into a tactical victory, a battalion rendered immobile and forced to surrender, and a stark reminder that in war, the smallest mistakes can carry the largest consequences. The capture of the German battalion sent ripples far beyond the frozen Ardennes Valley. While the broader Western Front remained contested, the loss of nearly 700 men in a single, largely avoidable incident highlighted vulnerabilities that German command could no longer ignore. Reports from higher headquarters emphasized the dangers of rigid adherence to procedure and the limitations of communication in complex terrain. Lessons drawn from the incident would influence both small unit doctrine and command training for months to come. For German officers in surrounding sectors, the surrender was a stark warning. Discipline and routine could no longer be assumed to prevent disaster. Commanders issued directives reinforcing vigilance, cross-checking reports, and immediate verification of all observed enemy movements. Morale, already challenged by winter conditions and fatigue, suffered further. Soldiers questioned how an entire battalion could be neutralized without a major assault, sowing unease and doubt. Journals and after-action reports from the period reveal that officers wrestled with the psychological impact of human error outweighing tactical competence, a humbling and sobering realization. Allied forces, conversely, gained more than just the captured soldiers and material. The incident became an operational case study, reinforcing the value of reconnaissance, observation, and rapid exploitation. Training emphasized how even minor errors in judgment could produce disproportionate outcomes if acted upon decisively. Commanders credited Bauer's misinterpretation as the catalyst, but they also acknowledged the skill and discipline of the Allied units that recognized, pursued, and leveraged the opportunity. The event validated the integration of intelligence, terrain analysis, and field execution, shaping tactical doctrine in subsequent months. Strategically, the temporary reduction of German defensive strength in the Ardennes had immediate benefits. Allied units could probe previously contested areas, adjust patrol routes, and apply pressure to adjacent sectors with reduced risk. The capture indirectly influenced troop deployments, artillery positioning, and reconnaissance scheduling, granting small but meaningful advantages to Allied planners. The psychological victory was equally significant. Soldiers witnessed firsthand how vigilance, timing, and rapid decision-making could neutralize a larger force, bolstering confidence in their operational methods. The broader historical significance was not lost on contemporary analysts. In war, singular events often shape perception as much as strategic maneuvers. The surrender became emblematic of the interplay between human error and opportunity. While the German battalion's capture did not alter the course of the war, it served as a microcosm of how small mistakes could escalate into decisive outcomes. Subsequent studies of the incident highlighted the importance of flexibility, clear communication, and situational awareness, principles that resonated far beyond the Ardennes and were referenced in training manuals and command briefings for years to follow. Even months later, veterans of both sides reflected on the incident with a mixture of awe and caution. For the German soldiers, the memory was humbling. Months of discipline undone by a combination of environmental conditions, delayed communication, and a single misjudged observation. For the Allies, it was instructive, almost serendipitous, a reminder that attentiveness, speed, and the courage to act decisively could convert mistakes into victories. The Ardennes Valley, frozen and silent after that fateful day, became a historical touchstone for the unpredictable interplay of human decision-making, terrain, and chance in warfare. By the end of the winter, the valley had returned to routine patrols, yet the shadow of January 17th lingered. Soldiers from both sides carried the lessons forward, that no formation, however disciplined, was immune to error, and that the smallest actions, an observation, a signal, a misstep, could resonate far beyond the moment. The consequences of that single day would shape attitudes, doctrine, and the psychological fabric of both armies, leaving an indelible mark on those who fought there. War is often measured in battles won or lost, in territory gained or destroyed, in numbers of men and material. Yet sometimes, the true weight of history rests on the smallest moments. A misread signal, a snap of a twig, the glance of a single soldier. January 17th, 1942, in the Ardennes Valley, is one such moment. One soldier's mistake, private, human, fallible, set into motion a chain of events that reshaped an entire battalion's fate. The capture of nearly 700 men without a conventional assault reminds us that warfare is as much a battle of perception and timing as it is of firepower and strategy. The terrain, the frost, the fog, the limitations of communication, all converge to amplify human error. Major Richter's disciplined battalion, trained and experienced, fell not to overwhelming force, but to the fragility inherent in human decision-making. And yet, the same circumstances allowed the Allies to act decisively, turning chance into advantage. There is a profound lesson in this. History is not always shaped by grand strategy alone, but by the interplay of human judgment, environmental conditions, and opportunity. Every soldier, every officer, every observer carries a responsibility far greater than the immediate task at hand, for even the smallest misstep can ripple outward in unforeseen ways. The Ardennes Valley stands as a testament to this delicate balance, the convergence of discipline and fallibility, preparation and unpredictability. For those who survived, the day left indelible marks. The German soldiers carried the shock of surrender, the humility of vulnerability, and a memory of how a minor misperception altered lives. The Allies carried the lesson of vigilance, observation, and the decisive value of acting upon opportunity. In the end, the valley's frozen ridges and silent trees bore witness not just to a tactical victory, but to the profound truth that in war, as in life, history often hinges on the smallest, most human of moments. And as the snow fell over the Ardennes, covering footprints and foxholes alike, the frozen silence served as a quiet reminder. Even in the machinery of war, human fallibility can change everything.